I teach kids most days of most weeks, about 2,000 bar mitzvahs later. I still look forward to the next and the next and the next. And what I often talk to them about is personal responsibility, because I think as much as I want to talk to them about Torah and Judaism, I want them to be grounded first in the meaning of life, in what makes a good adult life. And what makes a good adult life in small words is personal responsibility, big ideas. How many of us really understand what it is at this point in our life to be fully responsible for our story? That really means not blaming anybody else. It means owning who we are in this moment and the realities of our story. And sometimes what I do for the kids, maybe because it helps me see it and visualize it, is I put a little pie chart together. And I'll put on my whiteboard a circle. That's usually the start of a pie chart. This, by the way, is my math pie. It's perfect. And I'll put a little sliver of the pie, and what I'm pointing out to them is the majority of that pie in your adulthood represents the choices you're going to make. And the small sliver represents circumstances, things that will happen to you in life, and all of us sitting here know that things, in fact, do happen to us, over which we have no control and for which we have no responsibility. But a victim is somebody who lives the reverse of that pie chart. A victim at any age is somebody who constantly looks at the large part of the pie and says, most of my life I'm being victimized by God, by the world, by society, by my parents 50 years later, by the people around me. They're constantly seeing the inverse of what I'm trying to teach the kids, which is there's only a sliver of that pie chart, which are the things that happen, even tragic, that happen to us. Think about you in that story just for a second. Does that align with how you see yourself in the world today? Or does it align with how the people around you see you? Is that their perception of how you're living your life as fully actionable, responsible, activated in your story, knowing when to pray and when to buy insurance for that pie sliver? For the rest, I don't believe we should pray to God other than to give us clarity, perhaps, and strength, and the ability to wake up the next day to be fully responsible and aware of who we are and what we might do to make a difference in this world. But as much as I've been teaching that for so many years, I'm not going to stop teaching that. I'm still espouse that idea, that belief. I think there's a little fallacy in it. I think there's a weakness in it. Like many truths, it's not fully true, and I don't believe that a lie in service of truth is anything other than a lie, so I want to be frank. And what I mean by that is, when we think about a good life, when we think about particularly the issue of our own happiness, which I talk to the kids about, what part of the pie chart contains your happiness, what you're responsible for, or what happens to you? But our happiness is partially a measure of the good, happy thoughts that we have, and it's partially a measure of our gratitude, which I've talked about, and we as a community have talked about for 33 years. The core fundamental value of gratitude, and also the byproduct that gratitude builds in us contentment or happiness, and contentment builds in us generosity. And I don't believe that God wants us to pursue happiness for his own sake. And I don't believe even the founders of this country wanted us to pursue happiness for its own end, but rather that happy people would be then more generous in this nation, and toward the world. So where's the weakness? Where's the fallacy in the argument? Because I think so far hearing what I'm saying, it makes sense. I think there's another part, which is the myth of self-reliance in relation to our happiness. And why do I think it's a myth? Because I think if we think that we are entirely responsible for our happiness, we take away some really important factors in our story, and they matter. If you think about what it is to be happy, think about what it meant when you were, for instance, 20 years old. So millennials surveyed about what they think most important in their lives, their greatest goal. Number one, 80% said to be rich. Most of the same people said to be famous. Now, by the way, hold on, before we laugh, we did too. I did too. Probably at 19 or 23 or 25, we had the same goals. But there's a certain point in our lives when we realize that they're not related, that they're bedfellows. They may live next to each other, but one isn't reliant on the other. Rich doesn't create happy. Famous certainly doesn't create happy, or there wouldn't be a whole industry to point it out. What large fraction of pharmacology is dealing with that issue alone? People realizing that all the things that they thought would make them happy ultimately aren't making them happy. I think the myth of self-reliance toward happiness begins with a phrase often that sounds like this, and sometimes it ends with this phrase, which is, if only I could. If only I could have more money, if only I could be with that person, if only I could wear that brand, if only I could drive that car, if only I could look like him and not like me. If only I could. And what that does for many of us is it makes us inherently unhappy. But what I want us to also realize, it doesn't necessarily lead us to goodness, which will ultimately lead us to happiness. If I have one more victory, if I publish my book, if I lose 15 pounds, if I do more yoga, if I live in this house, not that house, I will be happy. But the reality is, as I said before, the use of drugs, illicit and legal, teach us that it's just not working for many, many, many people. We need to, at least in these moments of clarity, think clearly about what happiness is and what it's derived from. And I want to tell you that it's the inverse in many ways of what I've been saying. We think the more independent I will be as we grow up, the happier I'll be. But I, at this point in my life, realize the more independence I relinquish, actually, the happier I am. And I'll explain. I was standing under a chuppah on a dock at a vineyard, and I watched a couple walk down the aisle toward each other. And I didn't want that walk or that moment to end, and I don't believe they did either. And I saw two people doing something so archaic, so old-fashioned, something so rejected in society today. They were walking toward each other. They were exchanging vows, commitments. They were saying in front of other people, this I will, and this I want, and this I commit to doing. And they exchanged bands of metal and put them on each other's fingers that means nothing unless it means everything. And to them it means and meant everything. And what they did in that strange moment saying, Hare at mekudeshet li, was saying, you are sacred to me. More old-fashioned words and ideas. But what they were doing, and what was interesting, what was actually astounding, I think, to many people, would be that this couple in the middle of their lives, firmly entrenched in the 21st century, happy and successful and doing well in life, made a decision to make commitments toward each other. They said, I am better when I'm not alone. They said, I am healthier when I'm not alone. They said, my impact is larger and more generous when I'm with you. If you think about what's so old-fashioned about it, I want to tell you what isn't old-fashioned. 35% of Americans over the age of 45 are chronically lonely. What does loneliness feel like? Fear, lack of solidity, fluidity, a tendency to make bad choices, a sense of being worth less. Only 8% of Americans report having meaningful conversations with their neighbors. Only 32% of Americans say they trust their neighbors. The fastest growing political party in America is unaffiliated. The fastest growing religious denomination is unaffiliated. Among youth, the largest religious group is none. Depression rates are rising. Mental health problems are rising. Dependence on mood-altering medications, as I've said, is at an all-time high and a perilous high. The suicide rate has risen 30% since 1999. For teens, the suicide rate has risen over the last several years by 70%. Life expectancy right now is falling and not rising. And again, like I said last night, why am I saying harrowing, disturbing thoughts and facts on a day like today? Because nothing changes us more urgently and quickly than urgency. We need urgency. We need a fire to run. We need to know that something is going to happen if nothing happens. We need to know that the status quo isn't good enough. We have to have conversations in our marriages, in our families, in our communities, in our chavarot that aren't only about what we're doing next and what our goals are and what we want from life, but to say, what are we going to do to change these dynamics so that they won't be part of our next chapters of our stories? What does loneliness look like for our kids away at college? And how are they supported? How might they be supported? What does loneliness materialize as for our seniors? And what can we as a community do beyond the days of Shiva and beyond the days of services to make an active effort to be in each other's lives, to learn together, to eat together, to feed one another, to strengthen each other as a community, but to strengthen not only the community, to look at the individual and know the community is only as strong as these individuals who strengthen these individuals. I remember reading every year in the book of Genesis that Abraham is told by God, Lech lecha me'artzecha, leave your land, leave all that you know, leave, go to college, go to those places that are foreign and remote from where you stand. And I imagine what it felt like for Abraham when God said, Lech lecha, which doesn't mean go people as a community, go, but it was speaking to one person, go. And on that journey, you'll find not only a promised land, but the promise within yourself. You'll find who you are as every journey will take us closer and closer to understanding who we are. But what's fascinating to me was I imagine Abraham in those moments climbing the mountain as a sole venturer, a man on an adventure. I remember him down in the valley. I imagine a man making a desert journey alone, but then I read the next sentences. And in the next sentences, God says, take all of the souls that you acquired in Haran, in that land. It's not a solo journey. I spoke to you about a collective journey. You need one another. Don't go alone. Make a journey with your community. Find what it is to be there for one another and to be there with one another. In Judaism, we say that the reward of a mitzvah, a good deed, an act of kindness, is the mitzvah itself. And I think that's true. Rather than looking for a reward, be content with the idea that you helped somebody. But what I want to say to us is by helping other people, the truth is we are helping ourselves because it changes the way we see who we are. There is no way to look in the mirror the next time you do after helping somebody else that you don't see a different person. We stand taller after those moments. The happiness that we achieve through engaging and helping each other is a different quality and kind of happiness that a new handbag can offer, that a shiny new vehicle can offer. There's nothing that we have manufactured, nothing physical that we have manufactured in all the years of being human that is as powerful as the interchange of two human beings, the exchange of value and values, what it is to stand up for one another and by one another, what it is to reach down and grasp another person and pull them up so they can continue the journey with it. The happiness that comes from if only I could might be a transformed happiness in this new year if you followed those words, the ellipsis, those dots, by saying, I might be more happy if I could get past my fear and engage more in the community. It might be a different kind of happiness if you said, I could be more happy if I could have the courage and the generosity to pick up the phone to the one person from whom I'm alienated, forgetting all the justifications. Just finding the humanity in the shared story, the shared DNA that made us who we are. The happiness that you might derive from other people and engagement from other people will actually move the needle at a time in our lives where many of us say, what will I actually do that will really make a difference? 8 more downward dogs. That's a yoga term, by the way. But the fact is there's nothing more powerful and nothing more empowering than realizing our agency in this world of each other's lives. If we can take that away from Yom Kippur, the idea that I need to do something different, which is to open my eyes to those people in this world who need me. I had a moment of watching my wife this morning on the way to the synagogue. She opened the window and handed a large bill to a homeless woman. And often you don't get a response or you'll get just a thank you. And this woman looked and she was looking down and she said, you have no idea how much embarrassment you just saved me from. How many times she would have had to beg people to come to that number. And I thought, wow, thank God we opened the window. To see another person, to find another person's eyes across from a piece of glass. It's so easy just to keep driving. It's so easy just to walk away. It's so easy just to find ourselves and close our doors and end up as we began, which is in a womb, not of our mother's creation, but our own. Isolated and alone and smaller and lonely. So why do we ignore the wisdom that says that the best thing we can do is to be in relationship. And that's because I think it's difficult and we want easy, quick fixes. The thing that we buy gives us a quick fix. It gives us an endorphin rush that says, I am happier and I might be able to return it. Maybe that's another addition some people add some happiness. But in reality, that meal, that bottle of wine, that handbag, that car, that vacation, all these things do feed us a moment of happiness, but it's a different kind of happiness that we get from the hard work, the challenge of rubbing friction against another person, of having to live close to another person and having to say, I'm sorry, sincerely, and having to say, I'm sorry again. This is me. It's my pattern of action, not yours. I need to change. And I care enough about you to make a commitment to that change. And having to rub so close to another person for so long that we start to see not only their vulnerabilities, their frailty, their weaknesses, but we discover our own. And what comes from discovering our own vulnerability? One of the most beautiful conditions of humanity, which is humility. Dropping our shoulders and realizing we are simply who we are. Simply. Not more sophisticatedly than that. Simply human beings. All struggling. Every single person in this seat and all those who aren't here. All strugglers. I think of Michelangelo's beautiful sculptures that I saw up in the Vatican Museum and then in the Uffizi in Florence. Blocks of wood with just the forms, an arm, an elbow, a head, a shoulder of people trying to break free. Some of those are more powerful to me than seeing a finished sculpture as beautiful as David is. Because David is free of the shackles, it seems. But you and I are more like the strugglers. I want to tell you a story and end with this. The story is a study has been done for 75 years at Harvard. Now, that's very rare. Usually, long studies last about 10, 12 years before they lose their steam, their funding usually. And what the team at Harvard has been doing is studying health and happiness over 75 years so far. 720 people they've been following every single year of 75 years. They meet with them. They check their blood work. They speak to their physicians, they read their charts, they speak to their children, their spouses, their workmates. They look at every aspect that is detectable of 720 people's lives, and what they discovered to me is staggering. One thing that makes people healthy, it ain't Lipitor. Sorry, it's Lipitor as well as relationship. 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 That's what it took Harvard to tell us. What we've known since the beginning of time, since the earliest books that we've had, that relationship counts more than anything else. Harvard said, we've studied 720 American people, men and women, and what we found is the quality of their relationships will determine their health and well-being and happiness more than any other factor. They took the group and they said, let's see at age 50 what will best predict their health and happiness at age 80. And what do you think it was? It was relationship. It wasn't the cholesterol count. It wasn't all those things that we say are the determiners of our well-being and our longevity. It was relationship. Isn't that what we need to know? Isn't that one of the most important takeaways of our lives? Relationship. Now you may say, I can be lonely in a relationship, and that's true. So it isn't just relationship. It isn't just having people from www.findmefriends.com. That's not going to work. It's real relationships. What the Harvard team found was it's relationships in which you feel the reliability of the other person or the other people. That's what we owe each other. That's how we give each other orech yamim, longevity. That's how we give each other happiness. That's how we say Chag Sameach on those good days. That's how we say Shana Tova on these days. That's how we say to one another, this year will be better because I will make a commitment to be reliable to you in this year. Then we realize what we can teach our kids about happiness. Yes, math and science and English and history and good grades and good universities and all those things, but relationships and relationships and relationships. So what might we do to lean into relationships in this year ahead? And I want to suggest that we lean into relationships. One is be willing to say, I forgive and I apologize often and fluently in any language that the person understands. The other is roll the window down to actually find and meet the people in your life. The other is maybe make a commitment to less screen time, because that's actually blocking relationships. The other is to find mealtime together, because that's building relationships. I spoke to you on Rosh Hashanah about that book, An Invisible Thread. It was so beautiful, that book. I want to recommend it again. Laura Schroff's book, An Invisible Friend, about this woman walking in New York, and she meets a homeless African-American boy, and they have 150 lunches together over the course of years. But one thing that happens when the boy comes to her family's home, she invites him out to Long Island. Some of you have been there. To her family's house for Thanksgiving. And the boy is staring not only at family, but he's staring at one thing in the big house, a dining table. And she looks and says, why is he staring at the dining table? And years later, about 20 years later, she comes to him when he has his own apartment in New York, and he has his own family, his own children. And he pulls her by the hand, he pulls her through the house, and he shows her that one thing, that object of pride that he has. It's a dining table. And he doesn't explain why. If you read the book, you understood. It's because that dining table is where he saw families commit to conversation, not just eating. He was a boy who sat in a drug-addled apartment where people were asleep and awake in all states of being around him. He ate meals on the floor and on the street, but there's something sacred called a dining table, where he saw other people whom he admired gathering and occasionally be eating, but constantly sharing their stories and their lives with one another. So that's what I wish for you. Not takeaway, but sit down. Meals shared, restaurants or at home. Choose your own chef or cook. But make the commitment to put the phone in the pocket or away, not on the table, but away from the table. Make a commitment to find the person whom you have chosen to alienate and pick up the phone to them and say, our disagreements are far less important than the bond that we share. I want to be in your life if I can, in whatever measure. I want you, despite all that might divide us in conversation, to join us and join me at heart. To realize that we can be there for one another, even in small measures. Forgiveness, relationship is sometimes being in the same room as another person. That's enough. And sometimes it's exchanging pleasantries with another person. That's another level. And sometimes it's